Irawati Karve is uh, her work on kinship is very familiar to the students. She did that work in 1953 on kinship. The title is Kinship Organization in India. So let us examine her approach in that work, and through that, what is her orientation. So the work that she did is like producing kinship map of India. This kinship map. She went by linguistic zones and kinship practices, north-south differences, and in between, what are they? And then here. And linguistic is also related to racial, and within the linguistic there are caste-wise practices. So in her work, language, caste, kinship and space are organized. And this is what we can say as extensive study instead of intensive. Extensive method and survey method. Extensive method was going out of the fashion in those years, 50s. But then Karve did extensive thing. This extensive was closer to surveys done during colonial times. But Karve followed extensive as opposed to intensive and followed survey method. Okay. And then she gathered this data with fieldwork. What is the kind of fieldwork she did? She was working in Pune University, and she had family responsibilities. She would spend only around 2 months in a year doing fieldwork. Like that, she worked for years. Between she started in Maharashtra, her work in 1938-39, and Kinship Organization in India is published in 1953. So, she has been doing fieldwork spending some months in a year. What would she do during her field work? She essentially travels, meets people, starting with her friends or any student connections and friends, going in train, going even by walk to tribal villages, interviewing people, sometimes taking government help, and then writing field notes. This is an extensive survey. So she would visit one place this year, does some work, and then next year some other region. And once she comes back, what she does is she makes sense of what she got through the study of literature. She is fond of literature. She studies a lot, and she is also a writer in Marathi. She was a translator as well as writer in Marathi. What she does is, through reading literature, she makes sense of the ethnographic data. And during her field work, it is not simply questionnaire or simply very structured interview. She listens a lot. She collects folk songs. She collects proverbs. So when she writes, she gives gives the reader a feeling of the situation. In fact, her kinship study portrays an intimate account of family life, and more so from woman's point of view. Woman's point of view. Nandini Sundar, who is on whose account I am basing this lesson, says that studying woman or gender relations is possible only through studies on kinship during those times. Only in 70s, exclusive women studies started in many departments, but otherwise, gender relations were not studied. It was studied through kinship, and that was what Irawati Karve was doing. She was first woman anthropologist, and also the word patriarchy, which we now use very regularly in a day-to-day conversation, was not in use at that time, was not much in use. So in that sense, Irawati Karve is part of creating awareness about women's issues, a pioneer in that direction. Okay. And one more thing about her fieldwork is that it is not simply about culture, but she also takes data on anthropometry, blood samples, She is interested in physical measurements. In fact, she did her PhD in physical anthropology in Germany. Why did she go to Germany instead of US or UK like others? It so happened that her husband finished his PhD in chemistry in Germany, so they were familiar. And plus, Germany at that time was investing a lot on Indological studies. And Germany around that time was interested in racial studies. Interested in eugenics. In fact, Irawati Karve's supervisor was an important member in this movement. Her German supervisor, Eugen Fischer, was a leading figure in eugenics. And it is assumed that physical as well as cultural characteristics are biologically inherited. And he supported Nazis, and he acted as a judge in Berlin Appellate Genetic Health Court, which was to determine who would be sterilized. So, Irawati Kar worked under him, and she herself did work in this direction. Her PhD thesis was on the normal asymmetry of the human skull. Normal asymmetry. But fortunately, she found no such racial differences in terms of asymmetry. Okay, so her physical anthropology background was an influence on her. So she would make these measurements. But how would physical measurements be related to culture? It is because language is related to race and caste. So by that time, racial origins of caste settled, and Irawati Karve was a student of Ghurye. So she knew the racial connection with caste, a racial basis of caste. So she was interested in taking physical measurements. Okay. And there is one more thing, is that she also followed, being a Ghurye student, Indological approach. Indological approach. Where would be Indological approach in kinship studies? Like Ghurye did, she traces things to ancient Sanskritic texts. And then she thinks, like Ghurye before thought, that traditions are can be finally traced to texts. So she was doing ancient texts, she was doing contemporary literature, but not tracing through medieval and times, but she just goes to the ancient text and links. And in that sense, she found some kind of unity in the diversity. But remember, all this is about Hindu kinship. As in Ghurye's work, there is no reference to Christians, no reference to Muslims. And also, the bias is towards the upper caste. Okay, so in her approach, there is Ghurye element, Risley element, physical anthropology element, and extensive survey element and fieldwork element. Okay, so these were her theoretical approaches. But on the whole, she managed to give an overall picture of the kinship pattern, how it was varying from north to south, and how it was varying in the degree of patriarchy. So through which certain broad generalizations were made possible. Okay, so that was her work on kinship. Now, she wrote another book, Hindu Society and Interpretation, in 1968. And here she makes certain very important observations on caste. First of all, what is the link between Hindu society and caste? To her, Hinduism is nothing but caste combination. Castes are distinct, and patchwork of the caste is Hinduism. That may mean obvious, but Irawati Karve made certain important observations which were not shared at that time. For example, the issue of how caste came, origins of caste. One approach is there is a society without caste, and then Aryans went and then divided and created castes. Aryans went and divided, or caste ideology went and divided. Okay. Why are there so many castes? Because caste split into subcastes. When some people moved to some other area or specialized in some other occupation. So broadly, this is the approach that Ghurye took. So caste going and dividing, varna going and dividing, Aryans going, dividing, or Aryan ideology going. But Karve took a different position, which seems valid. What is that? She took the position that this may not be the way the caste spread. Rather, caste was there before, which means endogamous ethnic entities are there. Endogamous groups are there. That is, jati were there before. And over those endogamous groups, varna system superimposed. So to her, subcaste is important and various subcastes merged into Varna system. Or by subcaste we mean various endogamous groups merged, which means this Varna is superimposed on Jati. Jati was there before. This is how she differed from Ghurye. I find this is a new way to look at caste. So in her analysis, subcaste played a very important role. That is, the minimum endogamous unit played an important role. Because it is from the minimum endogamous unit or the endogamous unit, she felt you would know the history of that group and the process of transition. Okay, a transition to hierarchy within a varna. So she went historical, empirical, and starting with the minimum unit. Okay, this is how she looked at the caste. She defined caste like this. Caste is a group which practices endogamy, has a particular area, generally within one linguistic region, of spread or dispersion, may have one or more traditional occupations, has a more or less determinate or flexible position in hierarchical scale, and has traditionally defined modes of behavior towards other castes. These are definition of caste. And in her analysis, subcaste plays an important role. She says, for all sociological and anthropometric investigations, one must start with the subcaste as the smallest social unit, because the subcastes are historical entities, preserving in their exclusiveness the memory of some socio-historical event. The generic terms like Brahmins and Marathas are of no value for historical investigation. She found, and any caste is made up of racial mixture. So that position was known clearly even by that time. Her work included blood groups, emphasized the importance of taking blood groups, subcastes, and from that she would determine population movements also. Blood groups now may look outdated, and they are outdated, but the idea is not outdated, because instead of blood group, now we take mtDNA and yDNA for this purpose. So the idea that biology is linked to caste, and it is linked to historical movements, are valid ideas even now. Okay. So what she had to say on caste are interesting. Next. she did certain surveys on certain issues which can come under what we call applied anthropology. Applied anthropology. And surveys she did also reveal the diverse topics she covered as an anthropologist. And in these surveys, she made certain observations which are very insightful. For example, she made observations on urbanization, on displacement, and role of space, spatial organization in the shaping of social relations. Okay. Let us see what she did. Okay. For example, in her 1965 study of Sugar Town Fault in Surat district, titled Social Dynamics of Growing Town and Surrounding Areas, she studied this emerging town producing sugar, and she made these observations. For example, she said that keeping the distinction between rural and urban or emphasizing it further hinders the real progress. Keeping the distinction between the rural and urban, emphasizing it further hinders the real progress of the rural areas. It might be an experiment worth trying in a few selected places to connect up the urban and the rural, the town and the villages into an interconnected unity in such a way that the town becomes the heart of lively social intercourse made easy through well-placed roads and well-placed villages. Okay. And her study maps transactions between the villages and the town. So this is an insightful vision of future of urbanization. And she understood, or she was she has understood the role of space in shaping the social organization. For example, in her study of the Indian village 1957, she showed how village is spatially organized and how boundaries shape subjective understanding and how they shape the gestalt of a village. So that is why we study settlement patterns in a village, to see the impact on social relations. Okay. And her work on weekly markets also brought out the role of space and social relations. And in 1969, she conducted a survey on the displaced by the Koyna Dam. And this dam was supposed to be a result of planned process where people were expected to be compensated for what they lost. There were no such plans in the previous dams, but in this dam, it was supposed to be a result of planning. And she conducted the survey in which she found that the displaced were very unhappy. So this is what she had to say. There is an atmosphere of anxiety and fear, of a certain amount of bitterness among people we visited, even supposing the people receive an equivalent of what they have lost in terms of material belongings. Nobody can compensate them for the loss of their ancestral homes, friends, marriage connections, etc. For the loss of these, they must be given something more than the cash equivalent of what they have lost by way of tangible belongings, especially when they see the rest of the state benefiting from the electricity provided by the dam. She covered many things in this, about uneven distribution, about social and psychological losses of the displaced, and why they need to get much more than what they are losing materially. Now we know they are not getting even what they are losing materially, and social and psychological costs of a dam are huge. So her observations are ahead of her times. Next, what did she have to say on tribal development? She worked on bills of West Khandesh. Again, this was on survey. And she said that they must be helped to advance, which means she did not believe that they had to be isolated. Also, she did not believe they had to be assimilated, because she said there should be no attempt to impose a sexual code or dietary habits. It means no assimilation. And they should be educated in mother tongue first, and then regional language. And once they are educated, she tells that they will tell us that great Jagannath of Puri is their gift to Hinduism. They will be proud of their past, and they will narrate their past to us. So this is a very progressive attitude towards tribal development, which anthropology theoretically accepted, though in practice it may not be followed.